Chapter 6 The Revolution Within, Parts 4, 5, and 6. Part 4 The Limits of Liberty. Not all Americans experienced the Revolution and its effects as an expansion of freedom. Individuals who maintained their allegiance to the British Crown, called Loyalists, lost their liberties. Many Loyalists, which included men and women from all social classes, had supported resistance in the 1760s, but opposed independence and war. About 20 to 25% of free Americans were Loyalists, and 20,000 Loyalists fought for the British. Although there were Loyalists in every colony, they were most numerous in New York, Pennsylvania, and the back country of Georgia and the Carolinas. The Revolutionary War took on the quality of a civil war in some places. Neighbors intimidated and insulted each other. Pacifists who refused to bear arms were arrested and their property seized. Many states required oaths of allegiance, and those who refused were stripped of their voting rights or expelled. Some Loyalists had their property confiscated. When the war ended, almost 100,000 Loyalists were exiled or voluntarily emigrated from the United States. Loyalists who stayed were reintegrated into American society. The Native American Indians particularly faced the Revolution as a loss of freedom. Between the Proclamation of 1763 and the American Revolution, colonists continued to move westward and claim Indian lands east of the Mississippi. Many leaders in the Revolution, including George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, were deeply involved in Western land speculation, and British efforts to restrain land speculation was a major grievance of the Virginians supporting independence. Different Indian tribes backed the British or the Americans in the conflict, and some tribes, like the Iroquois, split internally over the war and fought each other. Both the Americans and their Native American Indian enemies inflicted atrocities on each other and civilians. Independence created state governments that were democratically accountable to voters who wanted Indian lands. Many, including Thomas Jefferson, saw the war as an opportunity to secure more land and liberty for white Americans by expelling or conquering the Indians. The Treaty of Paris marked the end of a process whereby power in eastern North America moved from Indians to white Americans. Limiting the British in eastern North America to Canada, the agreement led the British to abandon their Indian allies and recognized American sovereignty over the entire region of the east of the Mississippi River, disregarding the natives who lived there. For Indians, on the other hand, freedom meant independence and possession of their own land, and they used Americans' language of liberty to defend themselves. For African Americans, the Revolution's ideals and the war presented an opportunity for freedom. In 1776, one-fifth of the new nation's inhabitants, about 500,000 people, were slaves. Slavery was central to the language of the Revolution. Other than liberty, it was the word most often used in this era's legal and political writings. Slavery, often defined as the opposite of liberty, was primarily political in its meaning and signified the denial of an individual's personal and political rights by arbitrary government. Even slave owners resisting or fighting the British expressed that they were enslaved by their enemies. Part 5 Slavery and the Revolution. By the Revolution, slavery was entrenched in every American colony. Nearly every founding father, North and South, owned slaves at some point. When writing of men's unalienable rights to liberty in the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson owned more than 100 slaves, all of whom made possible his pursuit of leisure and arts and science. Some patriots argued that slavery for blacks allowed freedom for whites by removing the dependent poor from the political nation and giving white men economic independence. John Locke's vision of the political community as a group of individuals who contracted together to protect their natural rights was also used to defend slavery. The rights of self-government and the protection of property from government interference, some argued, prevented the government from interfering with their human property. Government intervention with their slave property, these whites complained, would make slaves of them. By making liberty an absolute value and defining freedom as a universal entitlement rather than a set of rights limited to a particular place or people, the Revolution inevitably led to questions about slavery and its status in the new nation. Before independence, slavery was rarely discussed in public, even though enlightened opinion had come to see the institution as immoral, inefficient, and a relic of ancient barbarism. Quakers in the late 1600s had protested slavery, and by the American Revolution, many Pennsylvania Quakers had come to oppose slavery. Only with the Revolution, however, did slavery emerge as a subject of public debate and controversy. Many slaves realized that the revolutionaries' definition of liberty as a universal right opened the door for them to use this language to challenge their bondage. African Americans were the most persistent advocates of freedom as a universal entitlement, and they pressed revolutionary whites to follow their own principles. In the early 1770s, enslaved blacks in New England presented petitions to courts and legislatures asking Americans fighting English tyranny to end the tyranny which Americans exercised over their slaves. The war offered opportunities for escape, the incidence of which seemed to increase during the conflict. Although 5,000 slaves fought for American independence, by which some gained their freedom, many more slaves obtained their liberty by siding with the British. Several proclamations by British generals offered freedom to slaves who enlisted in the British military. Nearly 100,000 slaves, including many in Georgia and South Carolina, escaped and fled to British lines. Although by the end of the war many had been recaptured, nearly 20,000 former slaves faced being returned to their owners, like George Washington, who insisted that they rejoin their owners. But the British refused, and many emigrated to England or other British colonies. The Revolution momentarily seemed to threaten the perpetuation of slavery. During the war, most states banned or discouraged the further importation of African slaves, and the conflict devastated many southern plantations. In the 1780s, a significant number of slaveholders, especially in Virginia and Maryland, emancipated their slaves. This happened only very rarely in other southern states. Between 1777, when Vermont's new constitution prohibited slavery, and 1804, when New Jersey banned slavery, every state north of Maryland moved towards emancipation. This was the first time in history that legislatures had acted to end slavery. But even in the North, slaves' importance as property shaped the way emancipation unfolded. Most northern laws allowed for gradual emancipation. Living slaves were not freed. Only the children of slave mothers would become free after serving the master until adulthood, to compensate for the loss of property. Many northern slave owners were just as reluctant as southerners to emancipate their slaves after the war. The Revolution had a contradictory impact on American slavery and American freedom. Emancipation in the North, however gradual, came to distinguish free from slave states, and Northern abolition, voluntary emancipation in the South, and slave escapees created large free black communities for the first time in American history. Free black communities had their own leaders and established their own independent churches and schools. In all states except Maryland, South Carolina, and Georgia, free black men who met tax-paying or property requirements could vote. Despite all this, slavery survived the Revolutionary War and thrived in its aftermath. By 1790, there were 700,000 slaves in the United States, 200,000 more than had existed in 1776. Part 6. Daughters of Liberty. Women contributed to the struggle for national independence. At least one woman disguised herself as a man, enlisted in the Continental Army, and fought in several battles. Other patriot women protested merchants charging high prices, made homespun goods for the army, or passed information about the British to the rebel army. Other women formed ladies' associations to raise funds for American soldiers. The conflict pulled women into private and sometimes public political discussion. Most famously, Abigail Adams admonished her husband John Adams to remember the ladies when establishing government and rights in the new nation. Nevertheless, gender remained an important boundary of freedom in America. Independence did not change the family law inherited from Britain. Husbands still held legal authority over the body, property, and choices of their wives. While political freedom for men meant the right to self-government and consent over political arrangement that ruled over them, for women, the marriage contract was more important than the social contract. Woman's relationship to this society was mediated through her relationship to her husband. Women lacked the essential basis of political participation, autonomy founded on property ownership or control over one's own person. Most men considered women naturally submissive and irrational, and therefore unfit for citizenship. Public debate in the Revolutionary era saw men's rights as natural entitlements. Women's role was viewed in terms of duty and obligations, and their rights flowed from their roles as wives and mothers. By definition, the Republican citizen was male. Yet the Revolution did improve the status of many women. The ideology of Republican motherhood, produced by the Revolution, gave women the responsibility to train future citizens. Revolutionary leaders believed that the nation's morality would be developed by women within the household and family. While it ruled out women's direct participation in politics, Republican motherhood did encourage the expansion of women's educational opportunities. It also strengthened the emerging ideal of companionate marriage, in which marriages were cemented by affection and mutual dependency, rather than male authority. The Revolution also changed family structure. While slaves, as dependents on the male head of household, remained part of the owner's family, in the North, hired wage workers replacing indentured servants and apprentices who had once been considered family members were not seen as part of the household. The Revolution changed the lives of all Americans. On the one hand, the right to vote expanded for white men. Bound labor among whites declined, religious groups had greater freedoms, and blacks challenged slavery. On the other hand, Indians, loyalists, and slaves experienced the Revolution as a loss of freedom. Many Americans saw the Revolution as a struggle for freedom with worldwide significance. The Revolution inspired other fights for national independence and social equality, from the French Revolution to the Haitian Revolution and the Latin American Wars for Independence. But the struggle over the meaning of freedom within the United States continued long after independence had been won.